The morning Clara Whitmore walked out of her parents' house, her mother didn't even watch her go. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the words. The words she could have survived. Words could be argued with, turned over, eventually set aside. But her mother had simply turned back to the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, watching the yard as though her only daughter standing on the porch with a single travel bag was no more interesting than the weather. Her father had already moved to his chair. The door clicked shut behind her with the soft, indifferent sound of something being finished. Clara was 23 years old. She had buried her husband 4 months ago. And the two people who were supposed to be her family had just told her she was ashamed they no longer wanted to carry. She stood on that porch for 10 seconds, maybe 15, long enough to understand that nobody was coming back to the door. Then she picked up her bag and walked. If you've ever been made to feel like a burden by the people who are supposed to love you most, stay with this story. Because what happened to Clara next is something none of us could have predicted. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming, and hit the like button right now. Then drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels before it's done. The train station in Mill Haven was loud in a way that felt personal, as if the noise itself was meant to remind Clara that everyone around her had somewhere to be, and someone waiting for them at the other end. She bought her ticket with the last of the money she'd saved from the months she'd spent helping Thomas through his illness. $12.40. The man behind the counter didn't look at her face. He slid her ticket through the grate and was already looking past her before her fingers closed around it. That small dismissal barely registered anymore. She had grown so accustomed to people looking through her that she sometimes caught herself wondering if she had become genuinely invisible, the way old furniture becomes invisible. Present, functional once, now simply part of the background. The ticket read Blackstone Ridge. End of the line, in more than one sense. It was the kind of destination people chose when they were running out of options and too tired to be strategic about it. She had read a brief notice in the back pages of the Regional Gazette. A frontier settlement 2 days east, growing, needing hands, offering modest room and board for women willing to work domestic or agricultural positions. It wasn't a promise. It was barely even an advertisement. But it was something, and something was the only currency she had left. She found a seat near the back of the passenger car and placed her bag on her lap instead of the overhead rack. Not because she worried anyone would take it. There was nothing worth taking. But because holding it gave her hands something to do. The car filled slowly around her. 2 women traveling together laughed at something and settled into the seats across the aisle. A family with 3 children arranged themselves with practiced efficiency, parceling out snacks and complaints in equal measure. An older gentleman in a gray coat unfolded a newspaper and disappeared behind it. Nobody spoke to Clara. She didn't expect them to. What she did not expect was the quality of silence she would spend the next 2 days inside. It wasn't the silence of someone being ignored exactly. It was something more specific. The silence of someone who had temporarily ceased to matter to the world, who existed in a pocket of suspension between one life that had collapsed and another that had not yet taken any shape at all. She pressed her forehead against the glass and watched the flat farmland give way to scrub grass, and then to something wilder and less managed, and she tried to remember the last time she had felt like a person someone was glad to know. Thomas had been glad to know her. She was sure of that. Whatever else their marriage had been, and it had been many things, not all of them easy, he had looked at her like she was worth looking at, like her opinions were worth hearing, like the fact of her presence in a room was something he actively wanted. When he got sick, she had done everything she could. She had not been heroic about it. She had been scared and exhausted and sometimes quietly furious at how unfair it all was. And she had done it anyway, every single day for 11 months, because that was what loving someone actually looked like when it was put under pressure. Then he was gone. And it turned out that without him, she was just a young widow with no income, no household of her own, and apparently, according to her parents, no business expecting that family meant unconditional. Her mother had explained it with the particular cruelty of people who believe they are being practical. You're back here with nothing, Clara. You've got no money, no prospects, and a dead man's name. What are people supposed to think of us? Her father had said less, but the lines of his face had said the same thing in a different dialect. They were embarrassed by her. More specifically, they were embarrassed by her failure to remain attached to someone who could provide for her so that they would never have to. The train lurched over a rough section of track, and the coffee cup in the family's parceling arrangement tipped and spilled, and the mother made a sound of exhausted frustration, and one of the children started crying, and the car briefly filled with the small theatrical chaos of an ordinary family having an ordinary bad moment. Clara watched all of it with something she couldn't name, not quite longing, not quite grief, something that lived in the narrow space between the two. She was not a person given to self-pity. She had noticed this about herself even in the worst stretches of Thomas's illness, that her mind tended to skip past the question of why this was happening to her and move fairly quickly to the question of what she was going to do about it. It wasn't strength exactly. It was more like a temperamental allergy to staying still in a bad place. But even she had her limits, and as the train carried her further from everything familiar and the light outside began to thin toward evening, she felt those limits pressing in. She was 23 years old and alone in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people in the car around her. She closed her eyes and did not sleep. Blackstone Ridge announced itself through the window as a smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved into buildings. A main street with the characteristic ambition of frontier towns that had grown faster than they'd planned for, several establishments that appeared more permanent than they probably were, and a train platform that was surprisingly busy for the hour. Clara gathered her bag and stood before the train had fully stopped, which she recognized as a habit left over from the past year. Always moving slightly before it was necessary, always preparing for the next thing before the current thing was finished. Because stopping for too long meant there was space for everything she was trying not to think about. The platform was crowded. Several women had traveled from the same train, and there was a welcoming committee of sorts, men in their good clothes looking nervous and hopeful, townswomen with practical evaluating eyes, children running loose. Clara watched two women from the passenger car be greeted with the kind of warm, immediate attention that suggested they had corresponded ahead, that they were expected, that they were wanted. There was handshaking and the retrieval of larger luggage, and the introduction to people whose names would matter to those women going forward. Clara stepped off the train and stood on the platform, and nobody greeted her. This was not a surprise. She hadn't written ahead to anyone. She hadn't corresponded with anyone in Blackstone Ridge. She was here on the strength of a 4-line notice in a newspaper that hadn't even included a name to contact. She was here because the alternative was staying in Millhaven with parents who had made clear she was no longer welcome in the only home she'd ever known. Her arrival was not an arrival so much as a landing, like something dropped from a height, coming to rest in whatever configuration gravity decided. She looked around the platform for some posted notice, some indication of who she was supposed to talk to about work and lodging. She found a general store at the end of the platform and moved toward it, navigating the small knots of people without making eye contact. She heard, as she passed, fragments of conversation about her, or about the group of arriving women generally, and she caught enough to understand that opinions were already being formed about who was suitable and who was not, who looked capable and who looked like she'd be gone before winter. That one with the dark coat looks like she's never done a day's work outside. Clara didn't slow down. Inside the general store, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich was running something that functioned as an informal receiving operation. A ledger on the counter, a list of families and households that had expressed interest in domestic help, a practiced manner of assessing women who came through the door. She looked at Clara for about 4 seconds before forming an opinion that she didn't bother entirely to conceal. "Widow?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "How long?" "4 months." Mrs. Aldrich wrote something in the ledger. "Most of the positions have already been spoken for through correspondence. I have 3 remaining that didn't generate interest from women who wrote ahead." She said this with the tone of someone describing merchandise that hadn't moved. Not unkindly, but without any particular effort at delicacy either. "There's a laundry position, a boarding house kitchen position, and 1 ranching household out on the Carter property about 4 miles east. That last one nobody's taken because the man is widowed and has 2 young children and people think it's complicated." "What's complicated about it?" Mrs. Aldrich looked up from her ledger. "Mr. Carter's not easy. The girls are a handful. The ranch is in rougher shape than it was when his wife was alive. Most women who come through here looking for a soft landing don't want hard work." Clara said, "I'm not looking for a soft landing." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her a moment longer, then made another note in the ledger. She was standing on the platform again, waiting for the wagon that Mrs. Aldrich had arranged to collect the day's arrivals and deliver them to their respective placements, when the twins found her. She heard them before she saw them, two sets of quick footsteps and a kind of breathless conference being held in the half-whispered urgent tones of children who have decided something important. Then they were in front of her, two girls of about 8, identically built but not identically expressive. One with her chin tilted up and a direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to getting what she asked for, the other slightly behind, watching Clara with large, careful eyes. "We want her, Papa," the first one said, without preamble or introduction, apparently to someone behind Clara. Clara turned. The man walking toward her across the platform was tall, weathered in the way of men who spend most of their time outdoors, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to move through crowds without drawing attention, even when, like now, everyone was looking at him. He was maybe 35, maybe a few years more. His expression was not unfriendly exactly, but it was cautious. The expression of a man who had learned that things presented as solutions sometimes created new problems. He stopped a few feet from Clara and looked at his daughters. "Emma, Hazel, you don't just walk up to strangers and announce things." "We want her," the one called Emma repeated, with the sublime confidence of someone who has never been told that wanting things loudly doesn't guarantee getting them. The man looked at Clara. She noticed that his look was direct without being aggressive. He was trying to read her, the way a practical person reads a situation they haven't prepared for. Around them, she was aware that the platform's ambient conversation had quieted slightly. People were watching. "I apologize for them," he said. "They do this." "Do what?" "Decide things." He said it without smiling, but something in the way he said it suggested he was not entirely disapproving of the habit. He glanced at her bag, at the general shape of her presence on the platform. "Are you placed yet?" "Mrs. Aldrich is sending me out to the Carter Ranch." Something shifted in his expression slightly. "That's my ranch." Clara absorbed this. Then I suppose they didn't decide anything that wasn't already arranged. The girl Hazel, who had been watching this exchange with enormous seriousness, reached out and took hold of Clara's hand. Not tentatively, with the full matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has determined that this is simply where her hand belongs. Wyatt Carter looked at his daughter's hand holding the hand of a woman he had met 45 seconds ago. Then he looked at Clara's face, as if checking something. "Do you need a place to stay?" he asked. It was a strange question given that the arrangement had technically already been made, but Clara understood that he was asking something underneath the literal question, asking whether she was someone who would stay when it got hard, whether she was someone who had already decided to leave before she'd arrived, whether she was, in some fundamental way, present. "Yes," she said, and meant more by it than the word usually carried. He nodded, once, the way a man nods when he is filing something away rather than responding to it. Then he said, "Wagons over here," and turned and walked, and Emma ran after him, and Hazel kept hold of Clara's hand as if she'd always been doing it. The 4 miles to the ranch passed in a silence that was less uncomfortable than Clara expected. Wyatt drove. The girls sat in the back, having apparently exhausted their enthusiasm for dramatic public decision-making and now engaged in the quiet commerce of siblings, arguing in murmurs over a piece of string, arriving at some arrangement, abandoning it. Clara sat in the front beside Wyatt and watched the land change from the managed edges of town to something rawer and more demanding. The road was unpaved, and the wagon was not gentle. She grabbed the sideboard once when they hit a particularly rough stretch and didn't let go for a while. "You've done ranch work before?" Wyatt asked. "No." He didn't respond to that immediately. She expected something in his expression, skepticism, or the quiet recalibration of expectations. But he just kept his eyes on the road. "What work have you done?" "Household, some nursing." She paused. "My husband was sick for almost a year." "I'm sorry." She believed him. It was brief, but it didn't sound like something he said out of social reflex. It sounded like something said by someone who knew what loss of that kind actually felt like, who didn't need it elaborated. She remembered what Mrs. Aldrich had said about him being widowed. "How long ago did you lose your wife?" she asked, and then was immediately uncertain whether that was too direct. 2 years. He shifted the reins in his hands. Emma barely remembers her. Hazel remembers more than she lets on. Ahead, the shape of the Carter Ranch began to resolve through the fading afternoon light. A main house that had clearly been well built at some point, and had since accumulated the particular kind of weathering that comes from deferred maintenance rather than simple age. A barn. Several outbuildings. Fields that stretched further than she could see, with the fenced perimeters she would come to know intimately in the weeks ahead. It didn't look like a soft landing. It didn't look like anything except work. "I don't expect it'll be easy," Wyatt said, as if he'd tracked her observation. "I'm not going to tell you different. I didn't come here because I expected easy." He looked at her sidelong, briefly, that same checking expression she'd seen on the platform, as if he were trying to determine whether she meant it or whether she was performing the kind of stoic pragmatism that people perform when they want something and then abandon when the wanting is satisfied. She met his look with one that said she meant it. He turned his eyes back to the road. The wagon rolled through the gate and into the yard, and Hazel reached forward from the back seat and tugged Clara's sleeve once, pointing at something over the left fence. A horse moving along the fence line, a dark shape against the evening field. Clara looked. "That's Birch," Hazel said. "She runs along that fence every evening. Nobody knows why." It was the most either girl had said in the last 4 miles. Clara watched the horse run its private circuit along the fence in the thickening dark. "Maybe she just needs something to do," Clara said. Hazel thought about this very seriously. "Maybe," she allowed. Inside the main house, the kitchen was cold and the lamps hadn't been lit. Clara set her bag down without being told where, because there wasn't anyone to tell her, and found the lamp oil and the matches on the shelf above the stove with the particular instinct of someone who has spent years learning where things are in houses that are not hers. The kitchen came up around her in the small, expanding light. A table that needed scrubbing, dishes stacked with the unapologetic disorder of a household, running on minimum maintenance, a window above the sink that looked out onto the dark yard. She stood in that kitchen for a moment in the lamplight before anyone else came in, and she made a silent, private accounting. She had $12 and change. She had a single bag. She had 2 children who had decided she was theirs on the basis of 45 seconds of observation, and a man who was watching her with the careful caution of someone who had been disappointed before and did not intend to be surprised by disappointment again. She had nothing. She also had, for the first time in 4 months, a door she'd walked through rather than been pushed out of. She picked up the kettle and went to the pump and started filling it, because there were children who hadn't had supper, and a man who hadn't said he was hungry but almost certainly was, and the lamp was already lit, and the first thing that needed doing was always simply the next thing. She was still there when Wyatt came in and stopped in the kitchen doorway, finding the lamp burning and the kettle on, and someone moving through his kitchen like they had decided to be there. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, in the doorway of his own house. Clara turned from the stove and said, "Do you have potatoes?" "In the cellar," he said. "Then we'll have something hot in 40 minutes." He stood there one moment longer. Then he went to get the potatoes. The potatoes were soft in the middle and a little scorched on the bottom, and nobody said anything about it. That was the first meal Clara made in the Carter house. A rough potato soup with dried herbs she'd found in a tin above the stove, and a heel of bread she'd sliced and set near the heat to warm through. It was not good cooking. It was functional cooking, the kind that exists only to fill the space between hunger and not hunger, and she knew it. But Hazel had eaten 2 bowls without being asked, and Emma had stopped kicking the table leg halfway through, which Clara was learning to interpret as a sign of approval, and Wyatt had eaten everything in front of him without complaint, and then carried his bowl to the basin without being asked to. Small things. But Clara had spent enough time in households to know that the small things were where character actually lived. She washed the bowls that night by lamplight, while the girls got themselves to bed in the way of children who have been doing it without supervision long enough that the routine has become mechanical. The sounds of feet on the stairs, the distant negotiation over blankets, the eventual settling into quiet. Wyatt sat at the table with a ledger open in front of him, going over figures in the particular focused silence of someone working through a problem that doesn't have a clean solution. Clara didn't speak to him. She finished the washing, dried her hands, and said goodnight to his profile, and he said goodnight without looking up. And she found the small room off the back hallway that Mrs. Aldrich had noted was hers, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark for a long time before she finally lay down. She had not unpacked her bag. She noticed that. She left it sitting by the door as if some part of her had not yet committed to the fact of being here. She unpacked it in the morning. Bah! The first week at this Carter ranch taught Clara things about herself she hadn't known she didn't know. She had believed herself to be a capable person. She had run a household, managed a sick man's care, handled the administrative debris of a death that came with no preparation and very little money. And she was not wrong about that. But capability, she discovered, is not a fixed quantity. It is specific. What she was capable of and what this ranch required were two different sets of skills that overlapped only in their general commitment to not stopping when things became difficult. She did not know how to read the weather by the color of the morning sky. She did not know which of the horses could be trusted and which had moods that required navigation. She did not know the names of the fields or the logic of the fence lines or why certain gates needed to be chained and not just latched. She burned the first breakfast badly enough that the smoke reached upstairs, and Emma appeared at the kitchen doorway with the expression of a child who had seen this before and was deciding whether to be amused or alarmed. "Papa usually does eggs on the iron," Emma said, "not the copper." "Thank you," Clara said without turning from the stove. "The copper gets too hot." "I'm aware of that now." There was a pause. "I can show you which one is which if you want." Clara turned. Emma was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, trying to look casual about the offer, as if it hadn't cost her anything to make it. She was a child who held herself with a kind of compressed pride. Clara was learning, not arrogant exactly, but deeply aware of what she knew and what she didn't, and particular about the difference. "I'd appreciate that," Clara said. Emma pushed off the doorframe and came into the kitchen. They made the second batch of eggs together without saying much, and Clara let Emma lead without making a point of it, and the eggs were better, and that was that. Wyatt noticed. She could tell without him saying anything, which was becoming a familiar condition. He was not a man who narrated his observations. He watched, he registered, he filed. He had a quality of attention that wasn't quite surveillance and wasn't quite warmth, something more neutral than either, like a man who has been wrong about things before and is in no hurry to be wrong again. He showed her the fence lines that second day, walking her out to the east pasture in the early morning before the heat had built. He showed her the latch mechanism on the far gate and why it mattered that it be done a particular way. Something about the angle of the post and the way the ground had shifted, a small structural truth that the ranch had arrived at through accumulated experience rather than planning. He showed her how to read the water levels in the creek that ran along the south edge of the property, what normal looked like, and what it looked like when there had been upstream trouble. He explained these things in the practical, slightly clipped way of a man who assumes the person he's talking to is intelligent and doesn't need to be managed. She appreciated that more than she might have expected to. "The creek matters," he said. "If the level drops significantly, we've got maybe 3 days before the east pasture stock needs moving." "How often does that happen?" "Couple times a season. Depends on what's happening north." He looked at the water for a moment. "Margaret, my wife, she could read it better than I could. I learned from her." He said it the way people say things they've decided to say before they say them, deliberately, as if the decision required some small internal negotiation. Clara understood that he wasn't looking for a response to the fact of Margaret. He was just saying it because it was true, and because it was relevant, and possibly because the ranch was full of her, and ignoring that would have taken more effort than acknowledging it. "I'll learn," Clara said. He looked at her. Not the assessing look from the platform, something slightly different. Less like he was reading her and more like he was deciding whether what she'd said was a claim or a fact. "I know," he said finally, and walked back toward the barn. The town of Blackstone Ridge had a particular relationship with the Carter Ranch, and Clara began to understand it in pieces over the first 2 weeks. The ranch had been prosperous once, not extravagantly, but solidly, the kind of prosperity that comes from steady work and good management over years. Margaret Carter had apparently been a significant part of that management. Since her death, the solidity had become something that required more active maintenance to maintain the appearance of, and the town had noticed. Towns always notice. She encountered this when Wyatt took her and the girls into town for supplies at the end of her second week. It was a Saturday, which seemed to be when most of the population of Blackstone Ridge consolidated itself along the main street, and people had a way of looking at the four of them, at her specifically, that told her the subject had been discussed in her absence. She was standing outside the dry goods store, waiting for Wyatt to finish at the counter when a woman she hadn't met yet stopped beside her with the particular deliberateness of someone who has organized their approach. "You're the one staying out at the Carter place," the woman said. She was perhaps 50, with a face that had been outdoors for most of those years, and a manner that had probably always been direct. "Clara Whitmore." "Ruth Haynes. I run the boarding house on 2nd. She studied Clara with the frank, unhurried appraisal of someone who considers this her right. "How long are you planning to stay?" Clara looked at her. "I haven't thought about leaving." Ruth Haynes made a sound that was not quite skeptical and not quite approving. "Most of them think about it by the end of the first week. The cold comes early out there, and Carter's not exactly a man who makes things comfortable. He's not unkind." "No, he's not unkind." Ruth seemed to agree with that. He keeps himself behind something, and those girls are," she paused, choosing the word, "particular." "They're children who've been raising themselves for 2 years, Clara said. "That makes people particular." Ruth Haynes looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating something. "Where'd you come from?" "Millhaven." "What's there?" "My parents." "You didn't stay?" "No," Clara said. "I didn't stay." Whatever Ruth Haynes made of that, she kept it to herself, but she nodded with a kind of measured respect before moving on. The nod of someone who has decided to reserve judgment rather than deliver it, which Clara was starting to learn was the closest thing to warmth that frontier towns extended to strangers. But there were others who were less measured. She heard it in the comments that floated from the wrong side of conversations, about a widow with nothing to offer settling herself into a widower's household, about whether that was appropriate, about what exactly her intentions were. The words were never aimed directly at her. They were the kind of words that get said within earshot on the calculation that the target might not be paying attention. Clara was always paying attention. She had learned to pay attention years before, in the household where she grew up, where the words that mattered were almost never said directly to her face. She didn't let it show. She finished the supply run, loaded the wagon with Wyatt, got the girls settled in the back, and said nothing about any of it for the entire 4-mile drive home. Wyatt said nothing either, but she had the sense that he had heard some of it too, and that his silence was a different kind of silence from his usual kind, tighter, with something working behind it. It was Hazel who started teaching her things in earnest, and Clara hadn't anticipated how much she would learn from a 9-year-old. Hazel was the quieter twin, but not the simpler one. She had a way of watching the ranch's rhythms that suggested she had been storing observations for a long time, and she had decided at some point that Clara was someone worth sharing them with. She showed Clara which hens laid reliably and which were unreliable performers. She showed her the spot in the barn where the roof leaked and where to move the feed sacks when rain was coming. She showed her the path to the creek that avoided the worst of the morning mud and the shortcut back from the east pasture that saved 10 minutes on the walk. "How do you know all of this?" Clara asked one afternoon, watching Hazel demonstrate the proper way to check a horse's hoof for stones, something Clara had attempted earlier that day and gotten badly wrong. "Mama showed me some of it," Hazel said, focused on the hoof. "Papa showed me the rest, and some of it I just watched and figured out." "Your mother taught you to check hooves?" "Mama could do everything." Hazel said it simply, without performance, a statement of fact rather than a eulogy. "She was better at the ranch than Papa. He knows more about buying and selling and making deals. She knew about the land." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss her?" Hazel set the horse's hoof down with a gentle care that looked strange on someone her size, and turned to look at Clara with those large, serious eyes. "Every day," she said. "But I don't think about it the way Emma does." "How does Emma think about it?" "Emma gets angry." Hazel wiped her hands on her pants. "I just get quiet." Clara thought about the $12 in her bag, about her mother's face at the kitchen window, about the way grief had a different shape in every person who carried it. "That sounds familiar," she said. Hazel looked at her for a moment with the particular perception of children who have not yet learned to be polite about what they notice. "You lost someone too." "My husband." "Was he like Papa? Quiet?" "No," Clara said, and the word came with an involuntary small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. "He was loud, in a good way. He filled up the room." Hazel considered this. Papa fills up the room too, just differently. Clara looked toward the barn door and the late afternoon light beyond it, and didn't say anything for a moment. Yes, she said finally. I think you're right about that. By the end of the third week, she had a routine, not a comfortable one. She was not sure comfort was the word that would ever apply to the Carter Ranch, but a functional one, which was its own kind of achievement. She was up before the household and had the kitchen going before Wyatt came down, and they had worked out a kind of wordless morning choreography where she managed breakfast and he managed the first outdoor tasks, and they crossed paths at the table with the girls without it being awkward, which had not been guaranteed. She was getting better at the physical work. Her hands had stopped being sore in the specific unfamiliar way they'd hurt in the first week, and had moved on to a different kind of sore that felt more like adaptation than injury. She could mend a fence section now, not quickly, but correctly. She could manage the horse team on a short drive. She had learned which gates needed the particular latch treatment and which creek level meant trouble, and she had learned it by doing it wrong once first, which was the only real way she knew how to learn anything. What she had not learned was how to interpret Wyatt Carter. Not that he was unkind. Ruth Haynes had been right about that. He wasn't. He thanked her for meals, which her father had never done. He noticed when things were done well and said so briefly, which was more than she had expected. When the creek level dropped one morning and she was the first one to notice and came in to tell him before breakfast, he had looked at her with an expression that she couldn't entirely read, but that had something in it like respect. Not surprised respect, which would have been insulting, but the plain kind, as if she had confirmed something rather than revealed it. But he kept himself behind something, the way Ruth had said. There was a wall that didn't make itself obvious the way deliberate walls do. It was more like the quality of a room that is perfectly pleasant to be in and that you only notice has no windows when you've been inside long enough to start wanting to look out. She found out something about the nature of that wall on a Thursday evening in the fourth week when she was coming back from the creek path and heard him in the barn, talking. She stopped because she thought he might be talking to someone she hadn't heard arrive, some neighboring rancher or a hand she hadn't met. She waited a moment and realized he was talking to the horse, not the way people talk to horses when they're sentimental about it, but in a low, even conversational way, as if the horse were a person who happened to be bad at responding. I know, he was saying. I know it's late. We'll get the far fence done before the cold comes. I just need a few more weeks where nothing goes wrong. She heard the exhaustion in his voice that she had never heard in it when he was speaking to her or to the girls. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been the only load-bearing wall in a structure for too long and knows it and has no choice but to continue being it anyway. She backed up quietly and took the long way around to the house. She did not mention what she'd heard, but she thought about it for a long time that night, lying in the narrow bed that she had long since stopped thinking of as temporary. She thought about the ledger on the table and the fence lines and the deferred maintenance and the way the ranch had the specific quality of a thing being held together by will rather than ease. She had been thinking of her work here as probationary, as something she was doing to prove she could, something with an evaluation at the end of it. But lying in the dark, listening to the particular silence of a ranch at night, she started to understand that wasn't the right frame. There wasn't going to be an evaluation. There was just the work, accumulating, and what you did with it, and whether you stayed. She had been told all her life that she wasn't enough. Not in those words, necessarily, but in the thousand smaller ways that people communicate that information. The looking past, the measured silences, the faint surprise when she did something well, as if they had not expected it. Her parents had refined this to an art form. Even Thomas, who had loved her, had sometimes had a quality of gentle surprise at her competence that suggested he had entered the marriage with modest expectations. She was tired of being modest enough to meet low expectations. She turned over in the dark and thought, I will learn whatever this ranch needs me to know. Not because anyone asked her to, not to prove anything to Wyatt Carter or to the women on the main street of Blackstone Ridge who whispered things within earshot, but because the ranch needed it and the girls needed it, and she was here, and those were sufficient reasons. The day everything shifted was a Tuesday in the fifth week, and it started with an argument. She had been repairing the water trough in the east paddock, something she had decided to do on her own, without being asked, because she had noticed it was losing water faster than it should, and she had figured out the repair from watching Wyatt do a similar one on the other side of the barn. She was most of the way through it when Wyatt appeared at the paddock gate and stopped. "What are you doing?" he said. The trough was leaking. She didn't look up. "I found the split on the inner seam. I sealed it with the pine resin in the tool shed. I saw you use it on the barn door fitting last week." There was a pause. "I would have done that," he said. "You didn't know it was leaking yet." Another pause. "How'd you know?" "Water level was off by about an inch this morning. The cattle at the east end were restless. I checked it after breakfast." She finished tamping the seal and stood up, wiping her hands on her work apron, and looked at him. He was standing at the gate with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not annoyed exactly, and not impressed exactly, but something in the space between those two things that was harder to categorize. "You didn't need to do that alone," he said. "You could have come got me." "You were working the north fence." "Still." "The north fence needed doing and the trough needed doing," Clara said. "There were two of us." He looked at her for a moment. Then he came through the gate and crouched down to check her work, running his hand along the sealed seam with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has been checking work his whole life and knows what good looks like and what almost good looks like. "It's a clean seal," he said. "I know." He stood up and looked at her again, and this time, whatever the expression was, it stayed on his face long enough for her to get a better look at it. It was something like rearrangement, like a man looking at something he had filed under one category and discovering it belonged somewhere else. He said, "Emma told me you showed her how to make the bread hold its shape." "She already knew the basics. She just needed someone to show her the fold." "Hazel told me you asked about the fencing system." "I want to understand how it connects. The east and south sections, I mean. The way they relate to the water access." "Why?" "Because if I'm going to be useful here, I need to understand the whole thing, not just the parts I can see from the kitchen window." The word useful landed between them, and she felt him take it in the way you feel something land. Not dramatically, but with a small, definite weight. He didn't respond immediately. He looked out over the east pasture with the particular gaze of a man who is making up his mind about something. "I'll walk you through the south fence tomorrow," he said, "and the water rights situation. You should know about that." She hadn't asked about water rights. She hadn't known there was a situation. "What situation?" He turned from the pasture. "There's a man named Aldous Greaves who has a property 2 miles north of the creek. He's been trying to argue that the water access from the upper channel runs through his land and that he has precedence over the lower properties." He said it in the tone of someone who has explained this before and finds it increasingly tedious. "He's been making noise about it for about 6 months." "What kind of noise?" "The kind that's heading toward legal." Wyatt's jaw moved. "He's got money and a lawyer in Ridgefield who writes impressive-looking letters." "And you?" "I've got the deed and a property map that's 20 years old and a situation where I'm spending time I don't have on correspondence that shouldn't be necessary." Clara absorbed this. The ranch took on a slightly different shape around her. Not just a household in need of maintenance, but a household in need of defense. "I can read the correspondence," she said. "If you have it." He looked at her. "Why would you?" "Because 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and because if this goes the way it sounds like it might go, you'll want someone who isn't you to look at the language." She paused. "I handled some of my husband's, estate correspondence. I learned how to read legal language well enough." He was quiet for a long moment. The paddock was quiet around them, the water in the trough now holding steady, where before it had been dropping. "All right," he said, not with enthusiasm, with the careful, slightly reluctant quality of a man who is not accustomed to letting people into the parts of his life where things are actually fragile. "I'll bring you the letters tonight." She nodded and picked up her tools, and he went back toward the north fence, and for the rest of the afternoon she thought about a man named Aldous Greaves and 20-year-old property maps, and what it meant that Wyatt Carter had, just then, told her something true about the state of things. He brought the letters, 5 of them, in a box that also contained the deed and the original property survey and a hand-drawn supplementary map that Margaret had apparently made herself, more detailed than the official one, noting where the water actually ran and where the upper channel fed into the lower creek and where the land boundaries were in practice versus in the document. Clara sat with them at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, going through the legal language of the lawyer's letters, with the particular focus of someone who has learned that the thing that matters in a hostile document is usually not what it says most loudly, but what it assumes you won't look at carefully. Wyatt sat across from her with his own ledger, working in parallel, and after about an hour she found it. He's claiming precedence based on a water easement registered in 1868, she said. I know, that's what the letters are about. But the easement was registered for agricultural use of the surface water. It doesn't address the channel access. She looked up. Your deed predates his by 7 years and includes explicit language about the upper channel. His lawyer is writing as if the easement supersedes the deed, but it's an easement, not a title claim. They're different legal instruments. Wyatt had stopped writing in his ledger. He was looking at her. The 1868 easement is for agricultural irrigation access to the surface of the creek where it crosses his land, she continued. It says nothing about the channel itself or the water rights below the fork. Whoever is advising him is either confused about this or hoping you are. Wyatt said nothing for a moment. Then, how sure are you? I'm not a lawyer, but the language is plain. She slid Margaret's hand-drawn map across the table and pointed to the fork in the channel. See this? Margaret marked the fork. The easement coordinates are north of the fork. Your deed covers everything south of it, and including the channel access at the main stem. He looked at the map. He looked at it for a long time, not checking her reading, she sensed, but doing something more complicated. He was looking at his wife's handwriting, at the careful notation of a woman who had understood this land and had documented that understanding with a precision that was now, 2 years after her death, protecting it. She did this in case something happened, he said. Not to Clara, to the room. Clara said nothing. She waited. He was quiet for a little while longer. Then he said, I'll write to a lawyer in Ridgefield, not Greaves's man, someone else. There's a name on the deed, Clara said, an originating attorney. He might still practice, or someone in his office might. Wyatt wrote it down. He sat back in his chair and looked at the spread of papers on the table. The letters and the deed and Margaret's map and the notes Clara had made in the margin of the page she'd been working from. And the exhaustion she had heard in his voice in the barn was visible on his face now, but it was different. It was exhaustion alongside something else, something that looked like the first evidence of a held breath being released. Thank you, he said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything, steady, unadorned, but it landed differently from the way thank you usually lands at the end of a meal or a task. It landed with some weight behind it, the way words do when they mean more than they're saying. It's not done, Clara said, but it's better than it was this morning. He nodded. He began gathering the papers carefully, straightening the edges of the letters, and he set the deed and Margaret's map on top of the pile with a deliberateness that suggested he was thinking about them. She'd have liked you, he said. Clara did not know what to do with that. She sat very still for a moment. You don't know that. She liked people who paid attention. He said it plainly. She had no patience for people who didn't look at things carefully. A pause. You look at things carefully. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and somewhere in the barn, Birch made her nightly sound, a low, restless exhale that Clara had come to know as surely as she'd come to know the creak of the third porch step and the way the kitchen lamp dimmed slightly when the door was opened. She had been here 5 weeks, and the ranch had already learned her the way places learn people who stay in them. She gathered her notes and folded them and handed them to Wyatt, who added them to the box. Good night, she said. Good night, Clara. She walked down the hall to her room and closed the door, and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house. The girls asleep upstairs, the wind outside, the small night sounds of a working ranch settling itself for the hours before morning. The narrow bed was where it had been for 5 weeks, no different than it had been on the first night, but she had stopped noticing it was narrow. She had stopped noticing a lot of the things she had noticed at the beginning. What she noticed instead, lying there in the dark, was that for the first time since Thomas died, she had spent an evening doing something that felt like being necessary rather than acceptable. There was a difference. It was a large difference. She hadn't been able to articulate it until right now, in the dark, with the sound of the ranch around her. She had been necessary to Thomas. She had been necessary to his care, his comfort, his daily life. And she had given all of that without calculating what she received in return, because that was what love asked, and she had answered. But after Thomas, in the ruin of it, what she had learned from her parents was that necessary and valuable were apparently not the same thing, and that being needed did not protect you from being discarded. What she was learning here, slowly, imperfectly, in the middle of arguments about fence leaks and water easements and the fold in bread dough, was something she didn't have a clean name for yet, but it felt like it might be the beginning of an answer to a question she'd been carrying for a long time. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 weeks, she fell asleep before she finished thinking. The letter from the Ridgefield attorney arrived on a Wednesday, and it was better than either of them had hoped for. Clara had written the initial inquiry herself, at Wyatt's request, not because he couldn't write it, but because she had been the one to read the opposing correspondence most carefully, and she knew which details needed emphasis and which assumptions needed to be challenged before they calcified into accepted fact. She had drafted it at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening while Hazel read beside her and Emma sat on the porch doing whatever Emma did when she thought nobody was watching, which Clara had learned was usually some combination of worrying and planning. The attorney's name was Harlan Foss. I was 63, practiced in Ridgefield for 31 years, and he had the manner in his written correspondence of someone who found imprecise legal arguments personally offensive. His letter back was 7 pages and contained the phrase, "This easement claim is without merit as presented in the 3rd paragraph," which Clara read aloud to Wyatt over breakfast, while the girls ate and pretended not to be listening with total attention. "Without merit as presented," Wyatt repeated. He's being careful. That phrase does work. It means the claim isn't viable in the form Greaves's lawyer has constructed it, but it leaves room for Greaves to try a different construction. She set the letter down. But Foss also says he's reviewed the 1868 easement registration and confirms what I found. It's an agricultural surface easement, not a channel rights claim. He uses the word elementary to describe the distinction. "Elementary," Wyatt said. "He's annoyed on your behalf." Clara picked up her coffee. "I think that's useful." Emma, who had been performing profound disinterest in the entire conversation, said without looking up from her plate, "What does Greaves actually want?" Wyatt and Clara both looked at her. She continued eating. "That's not a simple question," Wyatt said. "Yes, it is," Emma said. "He either wants the water, or he wants the money you'd pay him to leave the water alone. Which one is it?" Clara watched Wyatt absorb his 8-year-old daughter's assessment of a land dispute that had been troubling him for 6 months. "Probably the second one," he said after a moment. "Then he'll stop when it costs him more to continue than he'd get from you." Emma pushed her plate toward the center of the table, signaling she was done. "That's what Mr. Aldrich said about the man who disputed his grain storage last year. He said the same thing." Wyatt looked at Clara. Clara looked at her coffee. "She's not wrong," Clara said. He sat with that for a moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The 7th week was when the cold started coming in earnest. It arrived with the characteristic dishonesty of late-season cold, a warm morning that lulled you, then an afternoon that dropped 15 degrees without ceremony, then a night where the wind had teeth. Clara had been warned about this, had been told the cold came early to Blackstone Ridge and stayed late, but being warned about cold and experiencing it were different events, and she spent the first genuinely cold night adding every available blanket to her bed and still waking twice with the particular bodily conviction that the house was trying to freeze her out. She mentioned it to no one. She found an extra wool blanket in the linen chest that hadn't been touched in what appeared to be a long time. There was a faint smell to it that she recognized without identifying consciously, the particular scent of things put away by a woman who was no longer there to take them out again. She shook it out and used it. The cold changed the work. It made every outdoor task harder and slower and more consequential, because things that could be deferred in mild weather could not be deferred in cold without cost. The water troughs needed checking twice daily. The cattle in the north pasture needed watching for the signs of cold stress that Wyatt described with the expertise of someone who had lost animals to a hard winter before and carried that knowledge the way people carry failures they've decided to learn from. The firewood situation in the house required Clara's close attention in a way it hadn't before, not because there wasn't enough, but because using it well and using it wastefully were meaningfully different outcomes. She learned to bank the kitchen fire at night, keeping it low enough to not burn through the wood, but alive enough that the kitchen wasn't starting from nothing at 5 in the morning. She learned it badly at first. She put it too low twice and woke to a genuinely cold stove, and had to restart from scratch in the dark, while her breath clouded in front of her. By the third attempt, she had found the balance, and she felt the small, private satisfaction of having solved something that the house had demanded she solve. Hazel was the one who told her, matter-of-factly one morning while they were doing breakfast together, that her mother had always banked the fire the same way. She used to check it twice in the night, Hazel said. Once after we went to bed, and once around midnight. Papa didn't know she did the midnight one until the winter after she was gone. How do you know he didn't know? Because I heard him tell Mr. Aldrich. Hazel cracked an egg against the bowl's edge with the neat confidence of a child who has been doing this since she could reach the counter. He said the house was always warm when he got up, and he thought that was just how it was, and then the first winter without her it wasn't. Clara listened to this and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was someone who did a lot of things that didn't get noticed until they weren't being done anymore." Hazel thought about that very seriously, the way she thought about most things. "Yes?" she said. "That's right." They cooked breakfast in comfortable silence after that. Well, the storm that had been threatening for 3 days finally arrived on a Thursday in the 8th week, and it arrived like something that had decided to stop being polite about it. Clara knew it was coming. She had learned enough about the sky above Blackstone Ridge to read the particular dark that gathered to the northwest and the way the temperature dropped in the 2 hours before a serious weather event. Not gradually, but in steps, as if the cold were climbing down a staircase. She had seen Wyatt watching the sky that morning and had seen in the set of his shoulders the thing she had learned to read as serious assessment rather than routine concern. At breakfast, she said, "How bad?" He said, "Bad enough. I need to get the north pasture cattle to the lower field before it hits. The fence on the east run needs one more check, and the barn roof has a section that I've been meaning to resecure. I didn't get to it last week. Tell me what to do first." He looked up from his plate. This was still something that happened, a brief moment of recalibration when she made an offer that was outside what he had categorized as her domain. She had noticed this happening less frequently over the weeks, but it still happened, and she had stopped being bothered by it because she had come to understand that it wasn't skepticism about her specifically. It was the habit of a man who had been alone in his responsibilities for 2 years and had structured his thinking around his own capacity rather than anyone else's. "The cattle," he said. "I'll handle the roof section. Can you and the girls?" "Emma can help me with the cattle. Hazel's better with the barn inventory. She should check the hay situation and make sure the water barrels inside are full before it hits." He looked at her with the expression she now knew as his version of approval. Not effusive, not demonstrative, just steady and acknowledging. "All right," he said. They split in 3 directions after breakfast. Hazel went to the barn with a running checklist she had apparently composed in her head on the walk across the yard. Emma pulled on her coat and boots with the business-like efficiency of a child who takes physical work seriously and considers being assigned it a form of respect. Clara followed Emma to the north pasture, and they began moving cattle in the way that Clara was still not expert at, but had become functional enough to be genuinely useful, making noise in the right places, moving in the right patterns, using the fence lines the way Wyatt had taught her to use them as guides rather than obstacles. It was hard work in the dropping temperature. Her hands were cold through her gloves by the first hour. Emma moved faster than her, and with more instinct, knowing each animal's particular stubbornness, knowing which ones would follow the lead of the others and which needed to be addressed individually. Clara watched her and adapted, and they developed a working rhythm that was clumsy in places and efficient in others, and got the north pasture cleared in about 2 hours. "You're better at this than you were," Emma said, when they had the last gate secured. She said it as a statement of observed fact, without condescension and without particular warmth, which, from Emma, was about as close to a compliment as it got. "I've had good teachers," Clara said. Emma considered whether this was sincere or polite. Apparently she decided sincere, because she nodded once and they started back toward the barn. The sky to the northwest had gone from dark to actively hostile. The light had that thick, specific quality that precedes serious weather, making everything look slightly unreal. The barn and the house too bright against the dark behind them. The yard's familiar shape slightly strange. They found Hazel inside the barn, inventory complete, hay situation assessed, water barrels full, with the particular satisfied air of someone who has done exactly what they were asked to do and done it correctly. Wyatt was on the barn roof, visible through the open upper doors, working the loose section with what looked like grim urgency. The wind had picked up significantly in the last 30 minutes and was making the work harder than it would have been even an hour ago. "How does it look?" Clara called up. "I need 10 more minutes." He didn't look down. "Maybe 15. The storm's not going to wait 15 minutes. "I'm aware of that, Clara." She looked at the roof section. The loose portion was on the south-facing side, the part that would take the worst of what was coming first. She could see what he was working with, a set of boards that had lifted at the edge, compromising the seal beneath them. Not a catastrophic failure, but the kind that became catastrophic once water and wind got underneath. "Hazel, stay in the barn," she said. "Emma, with me." She went to the tool area along the barn's interior wall and found what she needed: additional nails, the heavier mallet that was used for exterior work, a length of the tar paper that had been rolled and stored against the back wall. She handed the nails and mallet to Emma. "Can you get those up to your father?" Emma looked at the ladder on the interior wall leading to the upper level. "Yes." "Then go. Tell him I'm coming up the exterior with the tar paper." Emma was already moving. Clara took the tar paper and went out the side door and around the barn's exterior to where the access ladder ran up the south wall. The wind hit her fully when she came around the corner. Not playful, not gusty, but sustained and mean, the kind of wind that has direction and intention. She pressed the rolled tar paper against her body and climbed. The roof was worse from up here. The boards weren't just lifted. Two of them had begun to separate from the batten beneath, and the gap between them was wide enough that in serious rain it would channel water directly into the barn's upper storage. Wyatt was working one-handed, holding one board in place while trying to drive a nail with the other, and the wind was fighting him on both counts. Clara didn't ask. She moved to the board he was holding, pressed both hands against it, and held it while he drove the nail. It took 2 attempts because the first nail went in crooked and he had to pull it and restart, and during the restart the board tried to lift again and she pressed harder and said nothing. The second nail went in correctly. He moved to the adjacent board. Emma appeared at the upper opening and handed him the additional nails. He took them without stopping. They worked the section in stages, Wyatt driving, Clara holding, the wind contesting every move with the specific indignation of something that has decided it is owed more opposition than it's getting. Her hands were beyond cold now, into the territory of not fully reliable, and she was aware of her footing on the roof in the way you become aware of it when it matters, paying attention to the angle and the surface and the way the gusts came in pulses. When the last nail was in and the tar paper was tacked over the seam, Wyatt looked at the section and then at the sky and said, "That'll hold." "You sure?" "No, but it's the best we can do in the next 30 seconds. He looked at her hands. "Can you feel those?" "Mostly." "Get inside." He was already moving toward the roof access. "Now, Clara." They came down in the order that made sense, Clara first, then Wyatt, and they were barely back inside the barn when the storm hit in full. Not a gradual escalation. A wall. The sound of it against the barn roof was immediate and considerable, and the girls both looked up involuntarily, then looked at each other, and Clara saw in that look the particular sibling communication of children who have been through hard weather before in this barn and know what they're hearing. "It's holding," Wyatt said. He was looking at the ceiling. They stood in the barn listening to the storm deliver itself against the structure. Rain and wind in concert. The kind of weather that requires you to be somewhere rather than moving through it. The horses were agitated. Clara could hear them shifting and exhaling in the stalls behind her, the particular restless sound of large animals who know something is wrong and are confined. She moved without thinking to the nearest stall and spoke to the horse inside in the low, even way she had learned from watching Wyatt, and embarrassingly, from Hazel. "I know," she said. "I know." The horse didn't settle entirely, but it stopped the act of distress, and she heard Wyatt behind her make a very small sound that wasn't a word, but had the quality of one. They were in the barn for 2 hours while the worst of it passed. It wasn't comfortable. There was a chill that the horses helped with simply by existing, their warmth something Clara hadn't understood as a practical matter, until she had spent a winter on a working ranch. But the drafts through the barn boards were persistent, and the noise was continuous, and the girls eventually sat together against the interior wall with a horse blanket over their laps, doing what children do when they run out of alternatives, which was talk to each other in the half-private language of siblings. Wyatt checked the barn roof section twice during the 2 hours, going up to the loft and pressing his hand against the ceiling boards, checking for water, coming back down with either a neutral expression or a slightly less tense one. After the second check, he came and stood near Clara, who was sitting on a hay bale with her hands wrapped around each other, trying to get the feeling fully back. "Holding," he said. "Good." He sat down on the hay bale next to hers with the deliberate care of a man sitting down because he has decided to, rather than because he has run out of options. He looked tired. Not the bone tired of the voice she'd heard in the barn that night 4 weeks ago. Something different. The specific tiredness of someone who has been running on anticipation of a problem and is now adjusting to the fact that the problem arrived and they survived it. "You didn't have to come up on the roof," he said. "One person can't hold a board and drive a nail in that wind." "I know. I'm not criticizing." He paused. "I'm saying thank you." "You already said thank you to me twice." "This is a different situation." Clara looked at her hands. Her right knuckle had a cut she didn't remember getting. The cold had numbed it enough that she'd noticed the blood before she noticed the pain, and now the pain was arriving in the way feeling returns, with an unhelpful amount of enthusiasm. "It's a roof," she said. "It's my barn," he said. "It's the girls' hay for the winter. It's—" He stopped. He had a way of stopping that wasn't uncertainty. It was more like editing, like a man who knows what he wants to say and is considering whether to say it. You could have waited out the weather inside the house. Most people would have. The roof needed doing. "Most people," he said again, not quite repeating himself, more emphasizing something. "Most people in your situation would be thinking about what this position gives them and what it costs them. They'd be calculating." She looked at him directly. "And you think I'm not calculating?" "I think you are. I think you're just calculating different things than most people would." He held her gaze without any of the usual guardedness. "You're calculating what the ranch needs, not what you need from it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm continued its sustained assault on the world. The girls had gone quiet against the wall. Hazel apparently asleep against Emma's shoulder, Emma doing that thing she did where she watched everything without looking like she was watching. "I need things from it," Clara said. "Don't mistake me for someone who doesn't." "What do you need from it?" It was a direct question in the particular way of direct questions that surprise you. Not because the subject is unexpected, but because it had not been asked what she needed by someone who appeared to mean the question in a long time. "A place that doesn't feel temporary," she said. "Work that means something." She paused. "To not be something people are waiting to fail." He didn't respond right away. He turned the phrase over. "Who's been waiting for that?" "My whole life, mostly." He said, "That's not what I see when I look at you." She didn't know how to receive that. It wasn't flattery. It didn't have the quality of flattery, didn't have the slight elevation of something constructed to please. It had the quality of an observed fact being reported, which was, she was learning, how Wyatt Carter said most things that mattered. "What do you see?" she asked, and immediately felt exposed by the question, the way you feel exposed when you've asked something that reveals how much the answer matters. He seemed to understand this. He took his time. Someone who came here with nothing and put everything she had into the work anyway, without being asked to, without knowing what she'd get back. He looked toward the girls against the wall. "Hazel trusts you. She doesn't trust people easily since her mother." He looked back. "Emma shows you things. She doesn't show people things unless she's already decided they're worth showing." Clara felt something in her chest do a complicated thing that she did not entirely have a name for. It was not quite grief and not quite relief and not quite something else. Something that required more room than her chest currently had for it. "You looked at me on that platform like you were expecting me to be a problem," she said. "I was expecting you to be a problem," he said without apology. "Everyone who comes through here with a travel bag and no plan is a problem, or they become one. It's nothing against you specifically." "And now?" He was quiet for a moment that felt intentional. "Now I'm thinking I was wrong about what kind of problem you'd be." She looked at him. "What kind am I?" Something moved in his face, that almost smile from weeks ago, returning now with slightly more permission. The kind that fixes water troughs before you know they're leaking and climbs on barn roofs in a storm and reads legal correspondence at 11 at night. He paused. The kind that's harder to solve for than the usual kind. She said, "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment." It is, he said. It just doesn't sound like one. Outside, the storm was beginning to shift. Still heavy, but the solid wall quality of it had begun to break into something more intermittent, more negotiable. The horses sensed it before the humans did, their restlessness easing by degrees. Hazel slept on against Emma's shoulder. Emma met Clara's eyes across the dim barn and did not look away. When the storm let up enough to cross the yard, they moved back to the house in stages. The girls first, then Clara, then Wyatt, making a final check of the barn door latches. Clara got to the kitchen and started the fire from the banked coals, and had water heating before the girls had gotten their wet coats off in the entryway. The damage to the property was less than it could have been. A section of the east paddock fence had come down, something Clara found when she went out to check the perimeter in the storm's aftermath, slogging through mud in the gray post-rain light. The vegetable garden's outer framework had collapsed, which was less critical in late season but would need to be rebuilt. One of the smaller outbuildings had lost a portion of its roof sheeting. She made a list and left it on the table for Wyatt. He found it when he came in, read through it, and added 2 items she hadn't seen from her angle. Then he set it where she would find it in the morning, and they did not discuss the list that evening. And this, the easy mutual accountability of it, the way they had begun to operate like 2 people who understood the same system, was something Clara noticed without commenting on. Dinner that night was soup again, because it was what they had, and it was what the weather called for, and nobody was going to complain about soup when they had spent 2 hours in a barn listening to the world come apart at the seams. Hazel ate her whole bowl and fell asleep before it was cleared, and Wyatt carried her upstairs in the way of a man who has carried sleeping children many times and knows the specific navigation of it, the angle of the stairs, the shoulder adjustment at the top. Emma helped Clara wash up. This had begun happening in recent weeks without being arranged. Emma appearing at the basin after dinner, taking the drying cloth, working through the dishes in the same efficient silence that characterized most of her assistants. Clara had learned not to comment on it, because commenting on it seemed to remind Emma that she had chosen to do it, which occasionally led to Emma reconsidering. "The fence on the east side," Emma said, drying a bowl. "The post is rotted at the base. It wasn't just the storm." "I know. I saw it when I went out. Papa will try to do it himself Saturday. We'll help him." Emma set the bowl on the shelf. "You keep saying we." Clara glanced at her. "Does that bother you?" Emma was quiet for a moment, turning the drying cloth in her hands. "No," she said. She said it like someone who has checked and found the answer and is reporting it honestly. "I was just noticing." Clara handed her the next dish. "Your father said something in the barn today, about you showing people things only when you've decided they're worth showing." Emma dried the dish with more attention than it required. "He talks about me?" "He notices you. That's not the same as talking." Another pause. "What did he say exactly?" "That you show people things you've decided are worth seeing, and that you decided that about me." Clara looked at her. "Was he right?" Emma set the dish on the shelf with the others. She had her mother's hair, Wyatt had said once in passing, dark, with a particular wave to it that required management. She had her father's jaw. She had something in her eyes that belonged entirely to herself. "Yes," she said, quietly, without the compressed pride that usually armored her directness. Just plainly, as one person to another. Clara turned back to the basin. They finished the washing without speaking, and Emma hung the cloth on its hook and said goodnight and went upstairs. And Clara listened to her footsteps on the stairs, and then the familiar creak of the room above. She dried her own hands and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard, which was wet and dark and showed the scattered evidence of the storm's passage. Debris against the fence, the muddy rearrangement of the yard's surface, one of the smaller water buckets turned over near the barn door. Familiar damage. Manageable damage. The kind of damage that looked like catastrophe at night and revealed itself as work in the morning. She heard Wyatt come back downstairs from putting Hazel to bed. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway, which was something he did. Stopped in doorways before entering rooms, as if giving the room a moment to adjust to him. She had noticed this early and then stopped noticing it and now noticed it again, the way you re-notice the particular habits of people who have become familiar. "She's out," he said. "Emma?" "Upstairs." He came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of the coffee that she had left warming and stood with it at the table. She stayed at the window. The distance between them was the width of the kitchen, which was not a large distance. The roof held, she said. It held. The east fence post is rotted through. Not just storm damage. I know, I should have caught that. You have 30 things to catch at once. You missed one. She heard him set his cup down. She heard him take a breath. She didn't turn from the window because she was aware in a way that had no specific cause. The turning from the window felt like a decision, and she wasn't ready to make it. Clara. She turned. He was standing at the table with his hands braced on the surface and his face with the look she had come to know best on him. Not the assessing look, not the almost smile, but the specific look of a man who has something he's decided to say and is in the final moment before saying it. The last internal negotiation. I've been thinking about what you said, in the barn, about not wanting to feel like something people are waiting to fail. She said nothing. She waited. I want you to know that isn't what this is, whatever this is. You should know that. He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. I'm not good at saying things the first time. I usually need to say them a few times before they come out right. Then try again. He looked up. You're not here on approval, he said. You haven't been for a while. I should have said that sooner. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire made its sounds. The window showed the dark, wet yard and the barn outline against the black sky, and somewhere behind the clouds that the storm had left behind, the night was proceeding without anyone's permission or refusal. Thank you, she said. It was the same 2 words he'd used, but she meant it the way he'd meant it in the barn, not as the end of a transaction, as the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet and didn't need one. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. She moved from the window to the basin to rinse her own cup, and they were close enough in the small kitchen that she was aware of him. The way you are aware of someone you have stopped pretending is simply a fact of your immediate environment, and started, without deciding to, regarding as someone specific. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. I went to his room and she went to hers, and the house settled into the night sounds she knew by heart now. The third step creak, the particular groan of the porch roof in wind, Birch doing her evening circuit along the south fence even in the aftermath of a storm, because some habits don't recognize weather as a reason to stop. Clara lay in the dark and thought about the roof and the fence post, and the east pasture cattle now safely in the lower field, and the list of damage on the kitchen table, and Hazel asleep mid-sentence, and Emma saying, "You keep saying we." She thought about a man standing at a kitchen table with his hands braced on the surface, telling her she was not on approval. She thought that this, all of this, the mud and the cold and the imperfect meals and the legal letters and the long days and the barn in a storm, this was what she had been trying to find when she had stood on her parents' porch with a travel bag and walked toward a train station and bought a ticket to the end of the line. Not safety, not ease, a place where being present was the same thing as being wanted. She closed her eyes, and outside, Birch ran her circuit in the wet dark, and the ranch held its breath the way it always did at the edge of night, waiting for morning to make demands of it again. The east fence post came out of the ground in 3 pieces, which told its own story about how long it had been compromised before the storm made it obvious. Wyatt had gone out Saturday morning with a replacement post and the tools, and Clara had been there with a spade before he'd finished loading the wagon, which produced a brief silence of the kind she had learned meant he was adjusting rather than objecting. Emma came out 5 minutes later in her work boots without being asked. Hazel followed with a bucket for the old concrete that needed breaking up at the base, because Hazel had an instinct for what would be needed next that Clara had come to rely on, in the same quiet way she relied on the reliable hens and the banked fire and all the other small systems that kept the ranch from sliding backward. They worked the post replacement through the morning. It was not elegant work. The ground had been waterlogged by the storm, and the old concrete base had fractured into irregular pieces that required significant persuasion to extract, and the new post had to be held level by 2 people while a third packed the base material around it, and the cold made everything slower and more disagreeable than it would have been in September. Clara's hands ached through her gloves. Wyatt's jaw had the set of a man doing the arithmetic on how many similar jobs still needed doing before the ground froze. They did not talk much while they worked. This was something Clara had grown comfortable with. The particular quality of silence that exists between people who are focused on the same task and don't need to narrate it. She had learned early in her life that some people fill silence because they're uncomfortable with it, and some people fill it because they want to be heard, and some people don't fill it at all because they understand that the work is the conversation. Wyatt was the third kind. She was learning that she was too. The post was set by midday. Emma checked the level without being asked and announced it was good. Hazel had the old concrete fragments loaded in the bucket. Wyatt drove the last brace nail and stood back and looked at it with the expression of a man who knows the difference between done and done well and is determining which category this falls into. "It'll hold," he said. "Better than the one it replaced," Clara said. That wasn't hard, but he said it with the almost smile, which she had come to recognize as his version of agreeing. They walked back to the house for the midday meal, the four of them spread out across the yard in the natural way they had developed over weeks. Wyatt a few steps ahead, checking the ground for anything that needed addressing. Emma beside him, pointing at something along the barn wall. Hazel walking with Clara and providing a detailed account of the structural integrity of the chicken coop that Clara had not asked for but found herself listening to with genuine attention. It occurred to her, between Hazel's assessment of the coop's eastern corner and the point where they reached the porch steps, that she had stopped noticing this was unusual. The four of them moving through the yard, dividing tasks, occupying space together, it had become, without any ceremony or announcement, simply what they did. The ranch had its rhythms, and they had all found their place in those rhythms, and it felt less like an arrangement that had been made and more like something that had always been the case and was only now being recognized. She did not say this to anyone. She put it in the same internal place where she kept the other things she had noticed and was not yet sure what to do with. The second letter from Harlan Foss arrived the following Tuesday, and it was considerably less encouraging than the first. Clara read it at the kitchen table while the girls were at their morning lessons. She had started sitting with them in the mornings, not formally teaching but available, which had evolved organically into something closer to actual teaching without anyone deciding that's what it was. She had sent them to the table with their arithmetic books and stepped away to check the post, and the Foss letter was there with two other pieces of correspondence. And she read it standing at the door because something in the first line told her it needed to be read immediately. Foss had written to Greaves's attorney in Ridgefield as a preliminary professional communication. The response had not been from the attorney. It had been from Aldous Greaves himself, addressed directly to Foss, which Foss described as procedurally irregular and personally revealing. Greaves had written to inform Foss that his client, Wyatt Carter, was in violation of a separate agreement, one that predated the water dispute, and that Greaves intended to raise formally if the water matter was not resolved to his satisfaction. The separate agreement was described in vague terms in Greaves's letter, which Foss had copied in full. It referenced a debt arrangement from 6 years prior, a business matter between Greaves and the Carter Ranch in which some form of financial consideration had been extended, and the full terms of repayment had been, according to Greaves, incompletely honored. Clara read this twice. Then she folded the letter carefully and went to find Wyatt. I was in the north pasture, checking the cattle that had been moved before the storm. She walked the distance in the cold with the letter in her coat pocket and found him at the north fence, looking at the herd with the particular focused assessment she recognized as different from simply looking. "Foss sent a second letter," she said. He turned. She handed it to him and watched his face while he read it, and she was careful about what she looked for in his face, because she had learned that Wyatt's expressions carried more information than they appeared to and required attention to interpret correctly. What she saw was not surprise. That was the first thing. He read Greaves's letter to Foss, and his expression moved through several things quickly. Anger, yes, but also something that looked like recognition, as if the shape of this was something he had anticipated without knowing the exact form it would take. He finished reading. He folded the letter along her creases and held it for a moment. "Of course," he said. Not to her, to the air. "You know what the debt arrangement is?" "Yes." She waited. 6 years ago, the ranch had a hard year," he said. "We lost most of the spring calves to disease. I was short on operating capital, and Greaves offered a bridge arrangement. He had cash. I needed it. We made a private agreement. I paid it back." He paused. "Most of it." "Most?" "There was a final installment. The year Margaret got sick." He said it with the flat precision of a man reporting a fact that has sharp edges. "I made 2 partial payments. We agreed to defer the remainder. It was a handshake agreement, nothing in writing. Greaves said at the time that the amount was small enough that formality wasn't necessary. Clara understood what she was hearing. And now he's going to claim the remainder wasn't paid and use the ambiguity of an unwritten agreement to make it look larger than it was. That's what I'd do if I were him. The words came out with a bitterness that he didn't usually let into his voice. How much was the remaining balance? The actual amount? $40. Maybe less. And what will he claim it is? Wyatt was quiet. I don't know. That's the problem with the handshake. Clara took the letter back from him and put it in her pocket. The cold moved around them. The cattle moved in their slow winter patterns behind the fence. Who else knew about this arrangement? Anyone who could corroborate the terms? He thought. Elliot Marsh, he was present for the original agreement. He's got a property north of Ridgefield. We haven't spoken in 2 years, but he was there. We need him to be willing to say what he heard. That's asking a favor from someone who doesn't owe me one. Do you owe him one? Wyatt was quiet for a moment, going through something internally. I helped him clear a drainage problem on his east field about 4 years ago. 2 days of work. He offered to pay me and I didn't take payment. Then he might consider you even if you ask. He looked at her with the expression that meant recalibrating, the one that appeared when she said something that shifted the shape of a problem he'd been looking at from one angle. You move fast, he said. Greaves is moving fast, she said. We should move faster. She wrote to Elliot Marsh that afternoon. She showed Wyatt the letter before sealing it, and he read it and made 2 changes, small ones, a word here, a clarification there, and handed it back without comment, which she had come to understand as his version of approval of the substantive content. She sent it with the Thursday Post. In the meantime, Greaves's presence in the situation had become something the town knew about. Clara was not surprised by this. Blackstone Ridge was not a large place, and Aldous Greaves was not a man who made legal maneuvers quietly. He had a quality of deliberate visibility, from what she had gathered. He made his moves where people could see them, because being seen was part of the pressure he was applying. He wanted Wyatt to feel the weight of community awareness, on top of the legal weight. She saw the effects of it on the first Saturday in town after the Foss letter. They had gone for the regular supply run, the 4 of them, as had become their pattern. And the quality of attention they received on the main street was different from what it had been the previous weeks. Not dramatically different. These were people who had developed a finely calibrated social instrument over years of frontier proximity, and they did not make their positions obvious unless they'd chosen to. But the glances were longer. The conversations that stopped when they passed were slightly less subtle about stopping. At the dry goods store, a man named Cotter, who ran the hardware side of the operation, had a manner with Wyatt that had a new caution in it, friendly still, but with the particular careful friendliness of someone who has heard something and is deciding how much weight to give it. Clara noticed. She noticed Wyatt noticing. She watched him absorb it with the stillness of a man who has decided not to give the thing the reaction it's designed to provoke. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Aldous Greaves made his appearance. She had not seen him before. He was a man in his 50s, well-dressed for Blackstone Ridge. Not extravagantly, but with the deliberate neatness of someone who has decided that appearance is a form of argument. He was broad-shouldered, not tall, with a face that had probably been affable once, and had since developed a quality of careful pleasantness that sat over something harder, the way a painted sign sits over old wood. He came down the Main Street boardwalk, and he stopped when he reached them, with the air of a man who has timed this and is pleased with the timing. Carter, he said, not unfriendly, precisely calibrated. Wyatt set a sack of grain in the wagon and turned. Greaves. The 2 men looked at each other with the particular quality of men who have a history that is not entirely adversarial and not entirely anything else. Clara kept loading the wagon. She did not look at Greaves. Heard you got some damage from the storm, Greaves said. Roof section on the barn. It's repaired. Good to hear. Greaves's eyes moved to Clara with a deliberateness that was meant to be noticed. I don't believe we've met. Clara Whitmore, she said, and did not offer her hand and did not stop what she was doing. The widow from Millhaven. He said it pleasantly. You've been at the Carter Ranch at... How long now? 2 months? About that. Quite a situation for a young woman on her own. He was speaking to her, but the words were aimed at the general vicinity of the street and everyone on it. Frontier life's not easy. Not everyone sticks it out. No, Clara said. Not everyone does. She picked up the last sack and put it in the wagon and brushed her hands together, and she looked at Greaves directly for the first time. He had the eyes of a man who was accustomed to people looking away from him and had organized a great deal of his operational strategy around that expectation. She did not look away. After a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable, Greaves returned his attention to Wyatt. I expect you've heard from my attorney by now. The debt matter. I've heard from Foss, Wyatt said. My attorney. Good man, Foss. Old school. Greaves smiled. I'm sure he's told you this doesn't need to be complicated. A simple resolution of outstanding matters, and we can both move on. The outstanding matter was resolved 6 years ago, Wyatt said, almost entirely. The remainder was deferred by mutual agreement in terms you're now choosing to misremember. Greaves's expression didn't change. Memory's a tricky thing. Elliot Marsh was present, Wyatt said. His memory tends to be reliable. The smallest flicker crossed Greaves's face, not quite a reaction, but the suppression of one, which was more revealing. He adjusted. Well, he said, I'm sure we can find a path through this that's agreeable to everyone. The pleasantness in his tone had the quality of something being stored for later use rather than genuinely offered. No need for it to become a community matter. It became a community matter when you wrote to my attorney about an unrelated dispute instead of addressing the water claim directly, Clara said. Both men looked at her. She had not planned to say it. It came from the same place that had put her hands on the barn roof board in the storm, a practical recognition that something needed doing, and she was the available person. Greaves looked at her with a reassessment she could feel happening behind his eyes. Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, she said. The water easement claim is without merit in the form your attorney has presented it. Your attorney knows this, which is why he pivoted to a private debt matter that has no documentation and depends on disputed recollection. She said it with the same tone she used to tell Wyatt the creek level was off. Matter of fact, observed. That's not a legal strategy. That's pressure. Greaves was quiet for a moment. The street around them had the quality of a space in which people have stopped pretending not to listen. You seem very confident for someone who arrived in this town with a travel bag and no prospects, he said. Still pleasant. But the pleasantness had thinned. I arrived with nothing, she said. That makes me very difficult to threaten. Greaves looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Wyatt. Then he smiled. A different smile, one that acknowledged something without conceding anything. Good day, Carter, he said, and moved on down the boardwalk. The street breathed again. Wyatt stood beside the wagon looking at the space Greaves had vacated. He said nothing for long enough that Emma, who had appeared at Clara's elbow at some point during this exchange, said, He didn't like that. No, Wyatt said. He didn't. Good, Emma said. Clara got up onto the wagon seat. Her hands were steady. She felt the peculiar calm that she had discovered she had in difficult moments. Not courage exactly, more like the absence of the particular kind of fear that requires you to have something to lose. She had stood on a porch with a travel bag once and understood what having nothing felt like, and it turned out having nothing gave you a specific kind of freedom that having something often didn't. Wyatt got up beside her. He gathered the reins and they sat for a moment before moving. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. You said essentially the same thing to me on the barn roof. He was quiet. This is different. How? Because that man will make your life harder for it. He said it as a fact, not a warning. He doesn't let things go. I know. She looked at her hands on her lap. Do you wish I hadn't? He looked at her. He held the look long enough that she turned to meet it. No, he said. And then, after a pause, but I'm thinking about what it costs you. Let me think about what it costs me, she said. You have enough to think about. He held her look a moment longer. Then he clicked the horse forward, and they moved down the main street of Blackstone Ridge, and she was aware that people were watching them go, and she let them watch. Greaves wasted no time. By the following week, the shape of his response had made itself clear through the channels that small towns use for such things. Not direct action, not yet, but the strategic placement of narrative. People began to have opinions about the Carter Ranch that they expressed in earshot of people who would carry those opinions along. The nature of Clara's position there became a subject of public interest in the particular frontier town way, where the subject itself is never directly named, but the implications are made clear enough. She was a young widow without resources. She was living in a widower's household. There were children involved. What exactly was the arrangement, and was it appropriate? And if there were financial difficulties at the Carter Ranch, which there appeared to be given this business with Greaves, was a woman in that position really being served by staying? Clara heard these conversations in the same way she had always heard them. Not because anyone said them to her face, but because the frontier was not as vast as it appeared from the outside, and sound carried. She said nothing about it to Wyatt directly. She thought about it alone, in the kitchen in the early mornings before the household woke, in the way she thought about things that required deciding, turning them over, finding their actual shape under the shape they presented. What she arrived at, after turning this one over for several days, was that the conversations didn't bother her in the way they were designed to bother her. The intended effect was humiliation, the implication that she was in a compromised position, that her presence at the ranch reflected poorly on her character or her judgment. But humiliation requires a particular kind of pride to operate on, the kind that relies on other people's approval to maintain its structure. She had come to Blackstone Ridge with nothing. She had come from a house where her own parents had decided she wasn't worth keeping. Whatever was being said on the main street of Blackstone Ridge about her appropriateness was mild, genuinely mild, compared to what she had already absorbed and kept walking through. What bothered her was the effect on Wyatt. She could see it, not in anything he said, but in the slight increase in the guardedness he carried when they were in town, the way he stood when men he knew spoke to him about matters that weren't the ranch, the additional weight in the silence he drove home in. She brought it up on a Wednesday evening because she had decided that not bringing it up was a choice to let it become something larger than it needed to be, and she had spent enough of her life not addressing things that needed addressing. The girls were in bed. Wyatt was at the table with the ledger. She sat down across from him without preamble and said, "Tell me what you're actually thinking about what Greaves is doing." He looked up. He put down his pen. "I'm thinking he's smarter than I gave him credit for." Specifically, he's not coming at the ranch directly. He's coming at the margin. The things around the ranch, the reputation, the water access as a future cost, the debt claim as a distraction. He said it with the controlled frustration of someone who respects a competent opponent even while despising their methods. He doesn't need to win any of it legally. He just needs to make maintaining the fight more expensive than settling. What would settling look like? He wants the water access, not the legal rights to it, just priority access when the creek runs low, which in practice means my cattle wait while his do not, which in a dry year means real loss. Wyatt's jaw moved. He's been after that for 3 years. Margaret wouldn't deal with him. I haven't either. Good. He looked at her. It might not be good. It might be the reason we're here. The reason you're here is that he's a man who's accustomed to getting what he wants by making the opposition too tired to continue. That's not a legal argument. That's endurance. She held his gaze. You're not tired. No, but I have limited resources for a long fight. You have Foss. You have Marsh's testimony when it comes. You have the documentation. She paused. And you have someone who can read his correspondence without losing the thread. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them made the kitchen smaller and warmer than it was, and outside the cold had settled in the way it had been settling for weeks, deep and final, the kind of cold that had given up pretending it would leave. What he's doing about you, Wyatt said. The talk in town. I know. It's not... He stopped, started again. You shouldn't have to absorb that because of this situation. It's not your situation. It's mine. She said it without heat. I'm here because I chose to be here. What people say about that is what people say. It doesn't change the fence post or the water level or the correspondence, and it doesn't change the fact that Hazel and Emma ate a hot meal tonight and will eat one tomorrow. I was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the assessing look, not the almost smile, not the weight of the hard admission. Something more open than those. Something she wasn't entirely sure how to receive. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. Tell me. The platform. When Emma grabbed your hand. He said it in the steady, slightly reluctant way he said things that required the internal negotiation to get out. I thought she'd take to whoever was willing to be kind to her. That she was just ready to attach to someone. He paused. But she wasn't. She'd already decided something about you, in about 30 seconds on a train platform. She's a perceptive kid. She's like her mother. He said it without bracing this time, plainly, the way he was starting to be able to say it. Margaret made decisions fast. She said hesitation was usually the mind arguing with something it already knew. Clara thought about this. What does she think she already knew? About you? About me? He was quiet for a moment. That you were staying, that you weren't, he chose the word carefully, passing through. She was right. I know. He held her gaze. I knew it by the second week. I just didn't know what to do about knowing it. What did you want to do about it? He looked at his hands on the table. I wanted to stop treating it like a surprise every time you did something that showed you meant it. He looked up. I kept waiting for you to stop. And then you climbed on the roof in a storm, and I thought, all right, she's not stopping. Clara felt the warmth of this in the specific way that warmth arrives when you've been cold for a long time. Not a dramatic flood of it, but a slow and reliable coming in. I'm not stopping, she said. I know. He picked up his pen and looked at the ledger, not to resume work, but to give himself somewhere to look while he said the next thing. I don't want you to. She said nothing for a moment. The fire worked. The ranch held its cold vigil outside. Then we agree, she said. He looked up. Something in his face had the quality of a thing that has been holding its own weight for a long time and has just been permitted to set it down. Yes, he said. We do. Elliot Marsh's letter arrived 10 days after Clara had sent hers, and it was everything they needed and not quite everything they had hoped for. He confirmed the existence of the debt arrangement. He confirmed the original terms. He confirmed having been present when Greaves offered the deferment on the remaining balance, and he confirmed that the amount discussed was small. His best recollection was between $35 and $45. He was willing to provide written testimony to that effect. He was not willing to come to Blackstone Ridge in person to testify. His wife was ill. He could not leave. He was sorry for this, but it was the fact of his situation, and he did not see a way around it. Clara read the letter to Wyatt and then sat with it and thought. Written testimony from a witness who isn't present to be cross-examined is weaker, she said. I know. But it's not worthless. Foss can use it. She was already composing the letter to Foss in her head. The value is that it establishes the existence of the agreement and gives an amount. Greaves can't claim $1,500 of undocumented debt when there's a witness saying the number was 40. Even in writing, that changes what's believable. Wyatt nodded. He had been watching her think, which she had stopped noticing as something unusual. He watched her think the way he watched the creek level, with patient attention, interested in the information. Send it to Foss, he said. She wrote the cover letter that evening, 3 pages, attaching Marsh's letter in full, walking Foss through the reasoning she had outlined to Wyatt, what the written testimony established, what it couldn't establish, and what she believed Foss could build from it in terms of a formal response to Greaves's attorney that would make the debt claim untenable. Foss's response came back within a week. He used the word persuasive. He outlined a path forward that involved a formal response letter to Greaves's attorney that would, in his estimation, significantly discourage continuation of this particular line of pursuit. He also noted, in a brief postscript, that he didn't typically receive correspondence from ranch households with this level of analytical clarity, and that whoever had been preparing Mr. Carter's communications appeared to have a useful mind. Clara read this postscript standing at the door, and then she folded the letter and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific private pleasure of having done something that only she knew was hard, and having done it well. She told no one about the postscript. The Saturday that changed things in Blackstone Ridge did not announce itself. It was a regular supply run, cold, clear, the kind of day that the frontier produced in winter that looked beautiful from inside and bit hard once you were in it. They had all come into town, the 4 of them, which was usual now. They moved through the supply list with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this together enough times that it required no coordination to execute. It was at the general store that it happened. They were near the door when Mabel Hurst, a woman of about 60, who ran the town's informal communication network with the same organizational rigor she applied to the Harvest Committee, came in from the street with the rapid energy of someone who has news and has already decided how to deploy it. She stopped when she saw the 4 of them. Clara had met her twice. She was not unkind. She was also not the kind of woman who let sentiment interfere with her assessment of social facts. "Mr. Carter," she said. And then, with the particular quality of a woman preparing to say something she has rehearsed, "I want to say something to you directly, because I think indirect has been going on long enough." The store had gone quiet. This was a small place, and there were 6 other people in it, and none of them were pretending to be busy. "I heard what that woman said to Greaves last Saturday," Mabel Hirsch said, and she nodded at Clara. "Not hostile, but specific. And I've been watching what's happening out at your ranch for 2 months, the way a person watches things in a small town. And I think some of what's been said about this situation has been unkind and unfair and based on the worst possible interpretation of what is plainly a straightforward situation." Nobody moved. "This woman came here with nothing," Mabel Hirsch said. She was talking to the store now, not just to Wyatt. "I've seen what she's done with that ranch. I've seen those girls. I've seen Wyatt Carter look like a man who is managing instead of drowning." She paused. "And I've watched this town say things about her that it wouldn't say about a man in the same position, and I'm tired of it." The store's silence had a different quality now. Ruth Haynes, who was at the counter, said, "She's right. I've been thinking the same." Cotter behind the hardware counter said nothing, but he had the look of a man who is actively updating his position. Clara stood in the middle of this and felt something complicated and unasked for moving through her chest. Not vindication exactly. She had not been waiting for the town's approval, had not organized herself around needing it. But there was something in being seen correctly, by people who had the choice to see you wrong, that hit differently from simply being left alone. It was the difference between being ignored and being regarded, and she had lived on the wrong side of that line long enough to know the distance between them. Wyatt stood beside her. She felt him adjust his weight slightly. Not agitation, more like the shift of a man who has been carrying something held out at arm's length and has just been told he can set it down. He looked at Mabel Hirsch. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, with the particular tartness of a woman who is embarrassed by her own sentimentality. "Just fix the Greaves situation and stop giving the gossips material." "Working on it," Wyatt said. She gave him one sharp nod and moved to the counter, and the store breathed again, and people resumed their business with the slightly altered quality of a room that has just had something adjusted in it. Emma had been standing beside Clara through all of this, and now she reached out without looking and found Clara's hand and held it. Not the way Hazel had on the platform, with the uncomplicated claiming of a child choosing someone new. With something more deliberate, the way a person holds on when they're not worried about being let go but want the contact anyway. Clara held on back. Wyatt looked down at this. His daughter's hand and Clara's hand, both of them standing in his local general store in the cold month of the frontier winter. And the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him. Not the almost smile. Something further along than that. Something that had given up being careful about what it revealed. They finished the supply run. They loaded the wagon. They drove home through the cold, clear afternoon with the 4 of them in their usual arrangement. And the sky above the road was that particular winter blue that requires nothing from you and offers everything. And Birch was already running her circuit along the south fence when they came through the gate, reliable as ever, doing her private thing for reasons nobody could name. Clara stepped down from the wagon and walked to the house and started the kitchen fire, because there were people who needed warming, and a meal that needed making, and a ranch that would ask things of all of them again in the morning, and these were sufficient reasons to keep going. She had arrived here with nothing. She was no longer certain that was true. Foss's formal response letter went to Greaves's attorney on a Tuesday in early December, and the silence that followed it was the particular silence of someone reading something they had not expected and deciding what it meant for their next move. Clara knew the letter was good. She had read the draft twice and offered 2 suggestions. One about the phrasing of the water easement argument, one about the framing of Marsh's written testimony. And Foss had incorporated both without comment, which she had come to understand was how competent people acknowledged that a suggestion was correct. The letter laid out the easement claim's legal insufficiency in plain terms that didn't leave room for creative reinterpretation. It attached Marsh's testimony with a cover note that made the debt claim's implausibility a matter of formal record. And it closed with a sentence that Foss had written himself, in the particular dry register of a man who has been practicing law for 30 years and has learned that certain things land harder when underplayed. A sentence that noted the Carter Ranch's willingness to pursue all available remedies should further action be taken on either matter. They waited. Wyatt did not talk about the waiting much. He worked the ranch the way he always worked it, with the focused, forward-moving attention of a man who has decided that what he can control is more worth his energy than what he can't. Clara watched this and found she had absorbed something of it over the months. This particular discipline of staying in the practical present when the uncertain future was pulling at you. She was not naturally patient. She was learning it the way she had learned everything here, by the demands of the work itself, which did not care what you were feeling about something else. The girls knew something was happening in the way children know things, not through information, but through the quality of the air in the household, the slight change in how the adults moved through the space. Hazel dealt with it by becoming even more observant than usual, which Clara had not thought was possible. Emma dealt with it by becoming more useful, taking on tasks without being asked, checking things that didn't need checking, as if her activity could hold the uncertainty at bay. On a Friday evening, 11 days after the Foss letter went out, Clara was in the kitchen when she heard Wyatt's step on the porch, and then a pause before the door opened, which told her something. He came in with a letter in his hand and his face with the controlled expression of someone who has read something and has not yet decided what to do with it. He set the letter on the table in front of her. It was from Greaves's attorney. 2 paragraphs. Formal, clipped, the kind of writing that costs its author something to produce because it requires acknowledging a position they don't want to be in. The water easement claim was being withdrawn pending review of the relevant documentation. The debt matter was described as subject to further clarification, which was the legal equivalent of a man setting something down on the table and sliding it away from himself without quite letting go. Not a surrender, but a retreat. Clara read it twice. She set it down. She looked at Wyatt. "It's not finished," she said. No. But he stopped pushing. "For now." Wyatt sat down across from her. He looked at the letter with the expression of a man who has fought something for long enough that the fighting has become its own kind of habit, and the pausing feels unfamiliar. Foss thinks he'll let the debt matter die quietly. Too much exposure if he pushes it with Marcia's testimony on record. Foss is right. He usually is. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The water claim might come back in a different form, different legal construction, like you said. Then we'll read that one too. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm. She had kept the fire well tonight because the cold had deepened in the past week into the serious kind that announced it was not going anywhere until it was ready. And the lamp was lit, and the house had the evening quiet of a household where children are upstairs doing whatever they do in the hour before sleep. It was, she thought, an ordinary evening. An ordinary evening in the middle of an ongoing, imperfect, unfinished situation, which was, she had come to understand, what most of life actually looked like when you stopped waiting for it to resolve into something cleaner. "Thank you," Wyatt said. He said it for the 3rd time since she'd arrived, and each time it had meant something different. This time it had the quality of something said at the end of a long piece of work. Not a transaction being closed, but a weight being named before it was set down. "You'd have found your way through it," she said. "Maybe." He didn't say it to be modest. He said it the way he said most things. Honestly, without performance. But it would have taken longer, and it would have cost more. He held her gaze. "You read things I didn't see. You wrote letters I couldn't have written. You stood on the main street and said things to Greaves's face that He stopped. "That I should have said sooner. You said them too. After you started." She thought about this. "That's not nothing," she said. "Starting is the hard part." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands on the table. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time with it." She waited. "I've been thinking about what this place is, what it's become." He chose his words with the careful deliberateness she had learned to recognize as him, saying something he'd been carrying for a while. "When you came here, it was a household that was failing quietly, not dramatically, just slowly, the way things fail when the thing holding them together isn't there anymore." He paused. "You know what it is now." "It's a working ranch," she said. "It's a home," he said. "There's a difference, and the difference is you." Clara felt something in her chest that she had felt before in this kitchen, in this house, and was still learning to receive without immediately deflecting. She let it settle before she spoke. "It's all of us," she said. "The girls, I know, but you're the reason the girls are who they are right now." Hazel trusts again. Emma lets people in. His voice had the quality of someone reporting things that are hard to say because they are true rather than because they are complicated. "I didn't know how to give them that. I could keep them safe. I could keep the ranch running. I couldn't give them that." She said nothing. She let it be said. "I'd like you to stay," Wyatt said. "Permanently. Not as a hired position." He looked up. "As my wife, if that's something you'd want." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him, at the face she had been reading for 3 months, that she knew now in its morning version and its exhausted version and its almost smile version, and the version it wore when he was doing the internal negotiation before saying something true. He was doing none of those things right now. He was just looking at her with the plain directness of a man who has said the thing and is now waiting for the answer without trying to influence it. She thought about her mother's back at the kitchen window. She thought about Thomas and the way he had filled a room and the 11 months of watching him leave it. She thought about a train ticket bought with $12.40 and a platform where nobody was waiting and a small girl who had taken her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. She thought about a barn roof in a storm, a legal letter written at a kitchen table at 11 at night, a water trough sealed with pine resin, a list of storm damage left on a table without discussion because they both already knew who would do what. She thought about what it meant to build something with another person, not the romantic version of it, the clean version that didn't account for the rotted fence posts and the cold mornings and the arguments about things that mattered and the things that were said badly and had to be said again. The actual version, which was work, sustained and unglamorous and punctuated by moments where you looked up from the work and found someone still there, still doing their part, still choosing to be present. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, just once, brief, the kind of breath that comes when something that has been held a long time is released. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held on, and they sat there in the warm kitchen with the cold pressing at the windows and the girls upstairs and the ranch around them going about its business in the dark. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that announces itself. It was quiet and imperfect and completely real. And Clara thought that was probably the only kind of moment that ever actually held. She told the girls the next morning. She had talked with Wyatt about how to do it, not at length, but enough, sitting at the table after he had asked her and she had said yes, talking through the practical shape of things with the same directness they brought to everything else. They had agreed that Wyatt would be there when she told them, because they were his daughters and this was his household, but that she would lead the telling because the relationship they had built was between the 4 of them equally, and it seemed wrong to frame it as something being announced to the girls from outside. She told them at breakfast, not with preamble or ceremony. She said that she and their father had talked and that she was going to stay, not as the woman who helped with the ranch, but permanently, as part of the family, if that was something they wanted too. She said that last part because she meant it. It mattered that they wanted it. Hazel looked at her with those enormous, careful eyes, and then looked at her father, and then looked back at Clara. "You were already part of the family," she said. Clara felt her throat tighten in the way it did when something true was said plainly by someone too young to know they were doing it. "I know," she said, "but this makes it official." Hazel considered this. "Like a document," she said, because she had been listening to 2 months of legal correspondence and had absorbed the lesson that things become real when they are written down. Something like that. Emma had not said anything. She was looking at her plate with the compressed expression she wore when she was working through something she wasn't ready to say yet. Clara waited. She had learned to wait for Emma. After a long moment, Emma looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way she was clearly not pleased about. "You're not going to leave," she said. Not a question, checking. "No," Clara said. "I'm not leaving." Emma nodded once, short and sharp, the way her father nodded when he was filing something. Then she picked up her fork and resumed her breakfast, and Clara saw in the set of her jaw the enormous effort of a 9-year-old managing the size of her own relief. Wyatt reached across the corner of the table and put his hand briefly on Emma's shoulder. Emma didn't look up, but she leaned into it slightly, for just a moment before straightening again and continuing to eat. Harlan Foss's final communication in the Greaves matter came in January, when the cold had settled into the landscape with the authority of something that had decided to stay. Greaves had formally withdrawn the water easement claim. The debt matter had been dropped without resolution, which in practice meant Greaves was absorbing the loss rather than continuing to pursue a case he knew could not hold. Foss's letter was concise and satisfied in the way of a man who has won something cleanly and doesn't need to celebrate it. Clara read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Wyatt was out on the early check, and she sat with it for a long time before he came in. When he did, she handed it to him without speaking and watched him read it. He set it down. He looked at the table. He said nothing for a moment. "Margaret's map," he said. "If she hadn't made that map—" "The map helped," Clara said, "but it was already yours. The rights were yours. She documented something that was true. She always knew what mattered to document." He said it with the particular quality she had learned. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but the thing that lives on the other side of grief when you have done the work of carrying it. A clear-eyed acknowledgement of loss that doesn't require you to stop living around it. She'd have handled Greaves in about 20 minutes. "Probably faster," Clara said. He looked at her. The almost smile arrived and then passed it, the fuller thing, the one that had been making more appearances since December. "She would have liked knowing you did it," he said. Clara thought about a woman she had never met, who had made a hand-drawn map of her land and filed it away against the possibility of future trouble, who had banked the fire in the night when everyone was sleeping, who had taught her daughters to check a horse's hoof and read a creek level and trust the land's rhythms. A woman who had understood what mattered and had documented it in every way she knew how. "I think she was someone who did the work without needing the credit," Clara said. "I understand that." "You do," he said. They sat together in the morning kitchen with the January cold pressing at the glass and the fire doing its work and the ranch waking up around them, and it was not a grand moment. It was Tuesday morning ordinary, which was, Clara had learned, what lasting things were actually made of. The wedding was small. This was not a sacrifice, and it was a preference, arrived at honestly by two people who had both attended enough performances of sentiment to know the difference between the thing and the display of the thing. Ruth Haynes came. Mabel Hurst came and brought her husband, who was quiet and agreeable. Harlan Foss sent a letter of congratulations from Ridgefield that managed to be warm without abandoning its professional register, which Clara found genuinely touching. Several of the neighboring ranchers and their families came. People Clara had come to know through the slow accumulation of borrowed tools and shared weather assessments, and the particular trust that frontier proximity produces between people who understand that hard seasons don't care about social categories. Elliot Marsh sent a letter. His wife was recovering. He was glad about the Greaves matter. He wished them well with a sincerity that came through even in the formal language he used, the way real things come through formal language when there is something real behind them. Emma wore her good dress and submitted to having her hair arranged by Hazel with the tolerance of someone who has decided the occasion merits accommodation. Hazel wore the same good dress in a different color and was visibly, quietly happy in the way she was visibly, quietly everything, with depth and without advertisement. Clara wore a dress she had made from cloth she had chosen at the dry goods store in November, without telling anyone what it was for. It was deep green, practical enough for frontier winters, not attempting to be anything it wasn't. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room, which would shortly not be her separate room, and saw someone she recognized, which had not always been the case. The ceremony was plain. The official from the county seat who conducted it was efficient and not unkind. Wyatt stood beside her and said what needed to be said in the steady, direct way he said everything that mattered, without performance and without hesitation. She said the same. Afterward, Emma brought her a cup of coffee with the manner of someone performing a service they have decided to perform voluntarily as a statement of position. Hazel held her hand for the entire first hour of the small gathering that followed, which was Hazel's way of saying what she would never make a speech about. Wyatt stood beside Clara through it all with the quality she had first seen on a train platform, the stillness of a man who was comfortable in his own ground. But it was different now. The ground was larger than it had been. Spring came the way. Spring always came to Blackstone Ridge, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week, then a cold snap, then warmth again that finally meant it. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and Clara checked it every morning with the attention Wyatt had taught her, reporting to him over breakfast with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has integrated a task so completely it no longer feels like a task. The east fence was rebuilt properly, with new posts set deep enough to outlast another decade of winters. The vegetable garden's outer framework was replaced and expanded. Clara had drawn out the new plan herself over February evenings, Hazel contributing opinions on which crops had done poorly last year and which had surprised everyone, Emma contributing skepticism about the optimistic projected yields that Clara privately thought was probably correct but declined to say. The water trough in the east paddock continued to hold. The barn roof, which they had secured in a storm on a cold afternoon with cold hands and wind fighting them every nail, had not moved since. Clara had checked it twice in the deepest cold of January, going up to the loft and pressing her hand against the boards the way Wyatt had done the night of the storm, checking for any tell of water. Both times it held. She had come down with the satisfaction of something she did not share because there was no one she needed to share it with to make it real. There is something that people who have been told they are not enough, told it quietly, told it persistently, told it in the thousand small ways that accumulate over a life into a settled belief about their own worth. There is something specific that happens to those people when they stay in a place long enough to see their own work outlast the worst season. It is not triumph. It is not vindication, exactly. It is something quieter and more durable than either. It is the understanding that the question of your worth was never really answered by the people who doubted it. It was only ever going to be answered by what you did with your hands and your mind and your time, in the actual conditions of your actual life, without the safety of ideal circumstances or the comfort of being already believed in. Clara Whitmore had come to Blackstone Ridge with a broken heart and $12.40, and a conviction she had not examined that she was probably not enough for whatever was coming. She had stayed because a child took her hand on a platform and because the alternative was going back to people who had decided she wasn't worth keeping. She had stayed through cold mornings and legal troubles and the particular exhaustion of building something in a place where nobody was obligated to want her there. And she had found, not easily, not cleanly, not without cost, that belonging is not something you are given by the places and people that claim you by accident of birth. It is something you make, with your hands, over time. In the unglamorous daily work of showing up and staying and doing what needs doing when it needs doing, without waiting for someone to tell you that you have earned the right to try. She did not become someone different in Blackstone Ridge. She became more of who she had always been, in conditions that asked for all of it. That is what the right place does when you find it or make it or both at once, which is usually how it actually happens. On a morning in late April, she stood at the kitchen window, her kitchen window, in her house, on the ranch that was now as fully hers as it was anyone's, and she watched Wyatt cross the yard with Emma beside him, pointing at something along the fence line with the earnest technical authority of a child who has decided she is learning to run a ranch and means every word of it. Hazel was in the barn already, because Hazel was always in the barn before anyone went to find her. Birch was running her morning circuit along the south fence, reliable as the creek and the cold and the spring that followed the cold, doing her private thing for reasons that had never been explained and never needed to be. Clara picked up her coffee and held it with both hands and looked at all of this. The imperfect, work-worn, ongoing, unmistakably real fact of the life she had built in the place she had come to by the slimmest and most accidental of margins. And she thought about her mother's back at the kitchen window in Mill Haven, the indifferent click of a door being closed. She thought, I am glad for the closed door. Not because cruelty deserves gratitude, but because the closed door sent her somewhere the open door never would have. She did not need the people who had turned away from her to understand what they had sent her toward. She only needed to keep showing up for it. Outside, Emma said something and Wyatt laughed. Actually laughed, a short and unguarded sound that still surprised Clara a little each time she heard it, because it had been rare when she arrived and wasn't rare anymore, and the sound of it came through the glass, and she stood there in the warm kitchen with her coffee and the sound of that laugh, and she thought, This is the thing, not the grand version of it, the actual version, The one you build with your hands, one ordinary day at a time, and never stop being glad you stayed for.